Hi again, Alex here with Common Sense Firearms Training out in Las Vegas, Nevada. The purpose of this video is we're going to talk about that grip. There's 1,000 videos out there about the grip. What we're going to do with this one though is we're going to really kind of go into that why factor, and that kind of helps solidify the argument. The most common grips that we see out there, there's kind of a few different versions, okay? And what we're going to start with is obviously we've got a cleared firearm, okay? Magazine is empty, nothing in the chamber, okay? So when we talk about our grip itself, the one-handed grip is actually still pretty universal across the world. The thing that's a little bit different, when you talk about your grips, we really like to use our reference points. Again, the idea behind shooting is it should become kind of a second nature, and it should be almost done by feel rather than by thought. And that way that frees up our thought process to think about the situation we're in as opposed to thinking about the shooting aspect. So we're going to start kind of building those reference points right here at the beginning when we talk about the grip. So the first thing we're going to talk about is when we grab hold of this, you want to get nice and high on this tang right in here, okay? This tang is actually the kind of the slang term for it is called a beaver tail. And what you really want to do is you want to grab as high as you can get, and you want to fill in as much of this gap as you can. You don't want there to be any space, okay? What happens is when this fires, all of this becomes a fulcrum. This all moves, all right? And what this creates is it creates a little bit of a cantilever effect, this being the fulcrum along that pivot point. So if it's a lower pivot point, you're going to end up with an increased pivot. You want to be as high up as you can get. Once we've got nice and high on this grip, what we're going to then think about is we're going to talk about the actual finger placement on the trigger. This actually kind of falls into your fundamentals as well. But what I tell people and what we like to do is we think about it kind of in reverse, okay? Once you've got a hold of your firearm, you don't necessarily need to think about, I need to put that exact pad on my finger. That's kind of a good reference point to start with. But the real meat and potatoes of it is that when you have pressed the trigger all the way to the rear, you need to ensure that right here at the actual breaking point, you have even pressure back, front, top, bottom, the whole way. You don't want to have anything in one direction or the other, because you can actually adjust your shot and change the point of impact simply in how you actually press the trigger. So what we tell people is once you've got that grip, get that perfect pressure point right in here, and once you've got it, release the trigger now, and that'll tell you where your finger should start. That then identifies your grip, okay? And then there's going to be a little bit of twist one way or the other. That's going to be, again, mostly determined on your trigger finger itself and how it falls in relation to the end of the trigger press, okay? So once we've done that, the other thing to remember is that whenever we aren't pressing that trigger, the finger needs to stay up here outside of the trigger guard, this being the trigger guard. When we talk about outside the trigger guard, this is not what we're talking about, okay? Reflexive motions can actually cause you to jerk if you end up in a bad situation, and that then drops you into the trigger, and that can turn into a negligent. We don't want to do that. So we stay up here along the frame. Once we're up here along the frame, even if you press on this, nothing's going to happen, okay? So this is a one-handed grip. The other thing that's usually a good reference point is right up under here, under the trigger guard itself. Your middle knuckle, somewhere in this area between the middle knuckle itself and the actual digit knuckle, is going to fit right underneath that trigger guard, and that's going to be your other reference point. So the three things you're looking for are where your trigger finger rests naturally. After you've identified where it's going to be on the trigger, move it up into the frame and figure out that's your point. Okay, for me actually on this particular firearm, that little nub that's right here is actually where that finger actually sits. The other reference point being your high tang grip, and then the other thing is going to be the middle finger along there. That's pretty universal. What this also tends to end up being a lot of times is as you press out, if you're straightening your arm completely out in front of you, it'll basically be in line with your arm, okay? Now that might not be the case when you actually go to fire. That's why you have to make sure that you actually kind of turn sideways to do it. So now when we start applying that second hand, we're going to show you here a demo in just a second with live fire that'll kind of explain and solidify all of this. But for now, we're just going to show you the grip itself and why we do it. And again, we like to use reference points. Okay, so the reference point we're going to use first is a lot of people tend to kind of try and want to grab up in this forward motion. They want to grab forward and get kind of up on the gun. If you can see where my palm is, there's a little bit of a gap in there. We don't want that gap, okay? We're actually trying to fill in the stuff back here. This is what's going to make that difference. Remember, the pivot point's back here. So we need to affect everything in this area. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually take that meaty portion of our palm, okay, and the meaty portion is going to be where we've got the thumb here, along all of this good firm meat along your hand. This is what we want to be pressed up against that firearm. Okay, so when we talk about the actual grip here, we're basically taking, if this is my one-handed grip, I'm just going to remove this thumb out of the way so I can get to all of this wonderful grip right in here. We're going to cut that thumb forward. We're going to fill in all of that grip there, and you see the palms are actually rubbing together here. We want friction together, and then we're going to push all that meaty portion of our hand onto that grip. This thumb wraps around, kind of a hitchhiker. Make sure we can free up those mechanisms to work the way they're supposed to, and then the thumb then finds its reference point along the frame. That tells me where it's supposed to be. So again, your 3 reference points for the other side: trigger finger on the other side, underneath the trigger guard, thumb along the frame, and palms pressing together. So now if you can see towards the back end here, there's literally almost nothing around the frame. We've got complete surface pressure all around it. Okay, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of a gap here, that doesn't really matter so much. As long as up here at the top end, we're making good contact. And then the other thing that allows you to do is if you kind of cant your wrist forward into kind of a 45-degree angle and keep that thumb pointed in a forward direction, you can rest it along the frame itself, and then you press that palm in, and that gives you another reference point. And then you actually want to give a little bit more of a squeeze with that support hand than you do on the firing hand, because that'll free up the muscles in your hand to give a little bit more smooth press. But when we say how much, whatever's comfortable. That's the most important thing, is you got to be comfortable. Okay. The other thing that we're going to notice is if you see this grip, I'm going to twist right here. Look at where the finger and the thumb are. They're pretty much almost identical on the spot here for the firearm itself. And the thumb itself might even be a little bit more forward. Okay. So when we talk about seeing this out without a gun, it would basically be kind of like this. Okay. Those thumbs and fingers are basically, they would be touching. The only difference is that when we hold the gun, there's a gun in the way. Okay. So we've got the forward cant locked out. This whole palm is pressing together. We're creating as much surface pressure as we can along the grip. And remember that it's more important along this back end that we're affecting where the pivot points are than it is that we get forward on the firearm. We need to make sure we're filling in those gaps. And then what happens a lot of times is when people first start doing this, especially on this particular Sig Sauer, this button right here is actually the slide catch. Okay, so if we're shooting this and we end up with an empty magazine, if my thumb is pressed down on that button, the slide won't be able to lock back. And we don't want to do that. We actually want the gun to work the way it's supposed to. We want to make sure we know about slide locks. So the other thing we're going to talk about is making sure that this thumb that we removed out of the way is actually going to kind of wrap around the back end of this wrist and kind of do what we call hitchhiking. It's just going to kind of stay on the back side. That frees up the mechanisms to work the way they're supposed to. So this would actually be an ideal grip. Okay, and what we're going to do here in just a second is I'm going to kind of show you, using live fire, why it does that, and we talk about those physiologies of it. The other thing that's nice about that is this particular support hand grip is so effective at eating the majority of that recoil and managing it for you that it actually frees up your firing hand in order to give it a little bit more support and stability, or rather, the support hand stabilizes the firearm, so your firing hand can actually manipulate the trigger and do all the things that are required for an accurate shot. What we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and show you how the gun recoils when we apply different hold methods to it. Okay. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to shoot it with one hand. Okay. And that way, what we can do is we can kind of identify where the path of least resistance sends the recoil. So when we press out here, if you watch the firearm with a single hand, I've got all this pressure over here and some pressure over here. So the recoil actually goes up and to the left. Since I'm a right-handed shooter, I have all this pressure over here, not so much over here, okay? So now if I actually change that up and I go with the left hand, I've got more pressure on this side than I do over here, and again, watch the recoil. Okay? So recoil sends it up and to the right this time. Again, pressure, no pressure, path of least resistance, that's just what it is. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get good pressure on both sides, and I'm going to get that, you see I don't have that high tang here, okay? So that high tang grip that we're looking for, it's not there right now. I'm decreasing the fulcrum point. Even though I've got good pressure on both sides, look at where the muzzle ends up. It goes straight up, okay? And again, that's because I decreased that fulcrum point. Okay, now when we talk about that support hand firing, what we need to really focus on is we're going to think about having that support hand do all of that work for handling the recoil for us. Okay, and the way we're going to kind of show that here, don't try this one at home, folks. So we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to shoot this with just the support hand and show you the kinesiology that's involved with this wrist lockdown. Okay, we've got good surface pressure across the entire face here, and even though there's not a lot of surface pressure over here, by applying that forward down lock, okay, it still eats a lot of the recoil in and of itself. So if we get that good high tang grip and we get this other support hand along with it, then watch the recoil. Okay? Now there is one other grip that's out there that's pretty prevalent, and what I want to do is I want to address it, okay? when we talk about doing what's called the isometric pressure, more of a thumbs up kind of hold, you'll see the support elbow drops down. As we press out, what ends up happening is that because we're applying this downward pressure, we're actually changing the movement ability that's involved with the firing wrist. And it actually changes the fulcrum point. It just changes it from the gun, it changes it back to the wrist. So what happens then is when we lock this down, you have to really think about locking out this wrist and everything else. But even with it all locked out, the gun still tends to, see where the rise is? It went up, okay? So when we talk about getting this perfect grip, what we're looking for is we want to make sure that, you know, again, if you're efficient with your firearm, shot 1 is important. Don't hands down, it's probably the most important. But shot 2, shot 3, and shot 4 should also be equally important. You shouldn't ever really give it the whole concept that, you know, I based my whole concept around just getting that one shot hit, because what if you miss? So you need to make sure that first shot, second shot, third shot are all going to fall right in line with minimal amount of effort. So what I'm going to do now, in fact, since we've got, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of what they call run the gun a little bit and let you see that recoil management, okay? Because you can get multiple shots right in a row very efficiently if you simply recoil manage correctly with a good hold, okay? All right. So when we talk about that recoil management, that good grip, hopefully you kind of got to see some of those reference points. It helps us kind of make things, it takes it away from your thought process so that you can actually start thinking about other things. Remember, shooting is reflexive. We want it to be. That way we can think about the issues that really matter, okay? Thanks for watching. I hope that you got something good out of this video. Get out, get educated, stay safe.